Hi there, it's Brendan Davis, and this week's episode of How China Works is also being cross-posted on my other podcast, If I Knew You Better. I'll explain a little bit more about that coming up next. Hi there, and welcome to How China Works, either as a returning listener or for the first time, maybe if you're catching this on the other podcast channel. I'm Brendan Davis. My co-host Ying Li is back in Beijing. I'm coming to you from a very lovely yet very noisy Palo Alto, California. I will talk about this in just a few moments. It is rather loud, as you can tell. There are both all the nice sounds of birds and nature, as well as some construction down the street. And I'm in a very lovely but very old home with very thin windows and walls. So nature kind of comes right in. So hopefully that just adds a little bit of color. I want to say a few things on both of our behalf. First of all, here with How China Works, we will be doing very sporadic shows for the time being, given the far-reaching impact of the novel coronavirus, now known as COVID-19. As I mentioned, I am safely ensconced here in the U.S. while Ying is back in China. She is good in terms of physical health, but the effects of this situation are something that I will say just a little bit more about in a moment, and I have some notes from her. First, though, today's show, David Thomas is our guest. Now, David has both an extraordinary family legacy in China, which is quite fascinating, as well as a personal one of his own making that's very substantial. It's a great talk. We recorded this conversation with David shortly before the Chinese New Year holiday really sort of got underway, about a week before that. And so we're very glad to bring it to you now. But first, let me give you a few thoughts for context on what's been happening lately from both Ying's perspective and also mine. I'll start with her. Ying gave me some notes, and she really had two primary thoughts that she wanted to talk about. The first was about COVID-19 specifically, and that its impact is both historical and personal. On the historic side of this, she mentioned that in addition to the efforts that are being made by China as far as its seriousness in terms of how seriously it's being taken, the other impacts are massive as well. There are changes to the lifestyle, with people being voluntarily or involuntarily quarantined. And one of the most interesting parts of this for her has been observing how it's forced everyone to slow down. Because, of course, in China, things typically move very fast, especially in the larger cities. And this has forced everyone to be more reflective and in one place. And I know this just from talking with my girlfriend, doing like a video call pretty much every night, how how people are thinking about things and their life and their future and just the way they work, because they're sort of locked into a place. She's also healthy, fortunately. But Ying talked about the personal aspect of this. She's really stuck there in the center of it, not in the epicenter, fortunately, of the outbreak. She's in Beijing, but she is observing this. She's feeling both on and offline how people are thinking and feeling and talking about this. And she really has direct experience. She also has quite a few relatives in Hubei province, which is the epicenter, in case you're not as knowledgeable about this. She has a couple of uncles from Wuhan, and among her family, she has several like first frontier medical supporters, people working at hospitals who are really keeping her up to date. And one of the interesting things that she mentioned is that traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, has been reported to be having some efficacy in whether it's treating the virus or treating some of the symptoms. That is something that there's a lot of conversation about. But it's interesting that if this is proven out, that maybe that would open the door to TCM in the West in a way, at least as a modality that's taken, frankly, more seriously. The other main point that Ying wanted me to sort of address on her behalf was the media's role in all of this. She stressed how, of course, the truth is always important, but more than ever, this flood of information that we get is not always helpful. It can create new challenges to try and know some objective truth. And of course, she mentioned something that I'm very familiar with from reading the Western media here in the States about how discrimination and xenophobia are very unfortunately running amok in places all over the world where they have Chinese residents or visitors or students or travelers or just people who are frankly Asian and people can't tell other people apart. And that's, we're not going to fix that on a podcast, but we wanted to mention that perhaps the media does have a role to play in helping to alleviate this situation. And I have seen some articles trying to shed light on it, although I don't know if the people who have such reactions are really that up on reading, the Washington Post or something. But it does point out that even people who are otherwise capable of critical thought can fall victim to the pernicious influence of disinformation. And so from now on, and especially moving forward, she really wanted to stress, and I'm kind of putting this in my own words from our notes, but everyone needs to work together to solve the problems that this whole situation creates, right? There are the direct problems, such as the medical issues, and then the indirect or related results that are really a societal impact. So there's the economic impact due to work stoppages and slowdowns, and the very small-scale local ones that people deal with one-on-one, whether it's missing their friends and family and loved ones, missing the socialization aspect, and of course the unfortunate side where there's discrimination. Now, as far as me, I am currently staying in my business partner's family home here in Palo Alto, and regarding this traditional Chinese medicine idea, this home was built and is still run by a highly respected anesthesiologist or former board member at Stanford Medical School. And of course, Western medical views of TCM are fairly dim. But I feel, and I think a lot of people, millions of people would agree with this, that there is a lot of wisdom to be found in TCM and other modalities. So I'm glad that everyone is searching for cures and treatments in any way that they can. So I'm rooting for whatever works, basically. Inking and I are going to be back with more shows as soon as we can get them to you, but especially if you're under quarantine yourself or in some situation where you listen to us regularly and you'd like some other shows to dig into, this is a great time to both catch up on our archives and also discover new shows to check out. Let us know what your favorites are, and we'll check them out too. We both listen to a lot of podcasts besides our own voices. I've personally been catching up a lot on Mark Maron's show WTF, plus a few of my other favorites. Tim Ferriss, who, depending on the guest, I will love it. If I'm interested in the guest or the topic, I will really enjoy that. There's also a great show by Brian Koppelman called The Moment. He is the co-creator and showrunner of a show on Showtime called Billions, but he has a long career as a film writer, and he often has very interesting guests and very thoughtful, funny shows. And I've also been listening to The Daily from the New York Times a lot. And of course, beyond all that, I'm very immersed. Being back here in the States, it's hard not to be immersed in the U.S. political news, and that's rarely dull in this era. But I've also been getting my other show, If I Knew You Better, out there. And my most recent few episodes, I'll say a word about that. Fred Taylor was my guest last week, a director with a 30-something-year career, director and producer, who's very thoughtful and candid and opinionated. And I always love talking to Fred. He was the first guest on that show, so I was glad to have him back. And also Chris Vogler did a round two with me. Chris Vogler is a writer and studio consultant from back in the day who wrote the classic book, The Writer's Journey, which detailed and really codified the hero's journey in storytelling. And there's a bit of a hero's journey happening with this story of COVID-19. And there's also a special 3-parter episode with my mom that is a hell of a tale of perseverance. And I, of course, have a personal interest in that one, but a lot of people have told me how moved they were by hearing her story and just how entertaining it was too. So check that out if you want to. As I said, I'm cross-posting this episode of How China Works to If I Knew You Better this week, because I want to help cross-pollinate the audience a little. So if you're listening on that channel, welcome, and I hope you enjoy this little visit and peek into another part of my life. In the coming weeks, we'll be back here on How China Works as we can. But if you want to hear me expound on topics besides China, please subscribe to If I Knew You Better. Lastly, stay tuned after the interview here for information on how you can help people in the most affected part of China as they deal with this massive health crisis that they are so bravely facing. We'll have some information about how you can actually contribute in a meaningful and secure way. Now, though, please enjoy our talk with David Thomas. So we are pleased to welcome David Thomas to the show. David, how are you today?
Great, thank you. Great to be with you.
Awesome to have you here.
Yeah, we're looking forward to this, and we know a little bit of your backstory, enough that we know we have a lot of great questions for you. Please first give us a brief self-introduction on yourself. Who are you, where are you from, and what's your story?
Yes, so I'm David Thomas. I live in Sydney, Australia, but I've also lived in London, where I grew up in the sort of 70s and 80s, and then in Hong Kong in the 80s and 90s. But I've lived in Australia since 1995. I have an interesting family background because my father, Michael Thomas QC, was the Attorney General in Hong Kong from 1983 to 1988, and he was brought in by the Hong Kong government to work with the Chinese and the British to enshrine the English rule of law into the Joint Declaration, which later became the Basic Law of Hong Kong. So I lived in Hong Kong with him during this period and subsequently, and of course this opened my eyes to, the exciting opportunities happening in China, that China was opening up and starting to deal with the West. And of course, I started to learn a lot about some of the cultural issues as well. So that was in the early 80s. I got excited about China, and I've been going back to China pretty much ever since being in Australia, working with Australian companies in China and working with Chinese investors and entrepreneurs in Australia. So I have a long background in the China space, and it's probably the defining part of my life, really.
Very impressive. So instead of calling yourself Thomas, like Thomas, right? You have a Chinese name, Tang Mingda. Would you like to explain to our audience briefly what do those Chinese characters culturally mean?
Well, the Tang dynasty, of course, is the dynasty that everybody respects and loves in China. But my Chinese name is a bit of a cheat, really, because my father was called Tang Mengji, which was, his sort of legal background. He was a sort of government official, and he had a long and impressive history in the legal profession. So when I went to Hong Kong, all my friends said, you should be Tang Mengda, because everybody will associate you with your father. And it's a bit cheating, really, because you're meant to be a brother or on the same level to take the first two characters. But anyway, so be it. I'm Tang Mengda, and it's always a good conversation starter. Everyone loves talking about my name.
So you're pretty happy about Mingda.
Very happy, and everybody thinks it's a very good name, as I hope you do.
That's pretty Chinese.
That's very cool. And, I always say, it ain't bragging if you can do it. So you come by your birthright, honestly.
Well, you don't get the chance to pick your own name, do you? So, if you're gonna do that, you might as well pick a good one.
Well, I couldn't agree more. How have some of the key trends in China, how have things evolved over all your years engaging? I mean, you have a deep history and you've got a pretty wide lens on this. What's it been like watching history in the way you have, and how have these things been evolving?
Well, it's been amazing to watch all this. And I think there are three key things that I think about. One is the enormous change that China's gone through from being an export-led economy, as it was until the global financial crisis of 2008, to an economy that's pretty much now driven by domestic consumption. And everyone thought that was not going to happen within 100 years, and it's happened within 10. And you can pretty much track the growth of these Chinese brands, Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei. You can pretty much track their growth from around 2008. So I saw 20 years of China as a sort of export-driven economy, and now 10 years of China as a consumption-driven economy. That's a major change in the way China is. And there's two others. I suppose the others are more simple. One is, I think China was really a copying economy. It's now becoming one of the most innovative economies in the world. And the other is that the one-child policy has thrown up all sorts of strange anomalies which create opportunity. For example, we've now got this big group called the Chinese millennials, who are all products of the one-child policy, have all got this money, this wealth, this aspiration from having their parents dote on them, are now traveling around the world, consuming and traveling and playing a part in global economies and being educated overseas. And on the other end of the scale, you've now got this massively aging population, some of which is very wealthy, which is also creating a few anomalies and opening up the aged care sector as an opportunity. So I think those are the three key trends that I've seen in the last 30 years that we're all now grappling with.
Sure, David, we did a little bit of research on your initiatives. So in one of your articles, you mentioned about what the West got wrong about China. You seem to have a lot to say, and we would like to have your opinions over here.
Yes, well, the West got one thing very wrong, which was that they believed that command and control economies, autocratic systems could not grow and be productive and create wealth without changing into a democracy. And that was a big assumption that was made, and it's proved to be totally wrong. China has managed to achieve everything it's achieved without changing its system at all. In fact, if anything, they've created more control. That's certainly one thing that the West got completely wrong about China. There are other things too, like, for example, they thought that the internet was something that would change China because they wouldn't be able to control it. But China's managed to do that as well. And so there were all sorts of assumptions made by America when China entered the WTO in 2001. That I think they thought China would learn from America, whereas I think, if anything, we're starting to learn more from China. And they made a whole lot of assumptions that I think 10 years later have proved to be completely wrong.
That's true, and actually, China has changed the internet for better and for worse, frankly. So that's a core assumption that, I was involved in computers from kind of the early days, and so watching that develop, that was definitely a shock when it didn't change. In your opinion, let me ask you the same question, but kind of flip China versus the West. What do you see China gets wrong about the West fundamentally?
Well, I think China I think it's changing, but I think China has made too many assumptions about the benefits of money and power and influence and connections, and have gone around the world doing business and investing in a Chinese way without necessarily adapting to the Western way. And I think there's plenty of examples in history of countries that have become wealthy and started exporting and going overseas and got it wrong. And I think China has a lot to learn about doing business in the West. And they've made lots of assumptions and got lots of them wrong. And I think China's taking a step backwards now in terms of their global international reach. And that's a good thing, because I think they've made lots of mistakes. They've lost lots of money. And now it's time for a rethink and a regroup. And then hopefully the second wave will be a lot more influential and a lot more profitable.
Well, I am interested to get into that a little bit more in a different context, but Ying is going to ask you something else before we do that.
Well, in your most recent article published on LinkedIn, you mentioned that Chinese companies are already designing, defining, and creating the future. And foreign entrepreneurs and business leaders who own or have access to new technology systems, capacity as intellectual property which can be commercialized and scaled up in China, have once in a lifetime opportunity to export their innovation to China and to really participate in earlier innovation stories. So we would like you to give us some details on how this is getting reviewed in the world at this point, and what are the specific examples, and how do Chinese receive this or engage with this?
Wow, yeah, big question. So, so let's start from the bottom. So firstly, China has some deficits in a few areas. Environmental protection is a big one. China has, in the process of going through their industrial revolution, have to some extent denigrated their environment. They need to sort that out, and they know that. And they are very interested in foreign technology that can purify water or deal with waste or convert plastic into something else, and that they know that they probably have to import that expertise from overseas. Remember that China has the money and the market, and so I think there's a once-in-a-generation opportunity for foreign entrepreneurs in this area, plus a few others, and I'll talk about them in a minute, to export that capability and commercialize it in China to solve some of China's problems, to raise money in China, to develop their technology and scale it up into China, and then to go global from China to the rest of the world. And I'd like to see that happen in environmental protection, which is one obvious area, but there's also others, particularly healthcare, food and food services, education, tourism, and actually the aged care sector too. As I mentioned, the one-child policy has thrown up this opportunity, I think, for the aged care sector. I think there's a unique opportunity for foreigners who have this capability to take it to China, to build and commercialize a China business, and then to go global from China.
And when you say foreign entrepreneurs and business leaders, are you particularly in reference to something from the countries like Australia, for example? How do Australian companies and entrepreneurs help Chinese ones to innovate? And do you have specific examples right now?
Yeah, well, we're doing a project right now for a Australian company that has a technology in biodegradable plastic. So they add a resin to the manufacturing process that allows plastic film that's used in agriculture. So, thousands of acres of Chinese crops are covered in plastic every year to protect them from the elements. Particularly the fragile crops like cotton and hemp and some of these others. So there's a huge amount of plastic film used in China to protect these crops. Our client has the capability to turn this plastic film into biodegradable plastic film. So this is a game changer for China. China has said that in the next 10 years they want most of their plastic to be eliminated. So it's a great example of where we can do a joint venture between an Australian technology provider and a Chinese manufacturer of plastic film to firstly take this technology, manufacture it in China, to distribute it into China, and then to take it globally to the rest of the world.
How do you, when you're talking to Australians and Australian companies, this is probably getting into a little bit more of the cultural area, how do you advise them to approach their dealing with China? We know the most basics, although it's fine to tick through a few of those, of course, but what are some of the deeper learnings? Because you obviously have a lot.
Yeah, well, obviously, the first thing everybody worries about is their intellectual property. So if we take our technology to China, how can we be sure that we're going to retain the rights to it? And that's obviously a major concern. There have been lots of examples of people that have lost their technology or been ripped off or have failed because of some looseness around IP enforcement, IP protection. So that's the first thing we have to overcome. And so to me, having a joint venture structure in China where both sides are mutually dependent on the other is the best way to resolve that. So in this particular case, we have a Chinese manufacturer which is desperate to get their hands on this resin, this technology, and we have an Australian company that are desperate to get access to the China market. So there's a sort of mutual dependency, which means that both sides can look after the other. But that definitely requires some time. And of course, the second most important thing is to build the relationship, not the transaction, because in the West we're very focused on transactions and making money and getting deals done. In China, it's much more about the relationship. And one of the things about this project that's meant it's gone so well is that the CEO of the Australian company has been very open to building a long-term relationship with his Chinese partners. And of course, we've helped facilitate that, but he's entered it in a very open-minded way. And I wish more people were like that, because not everybody is.
This is very true. Actually, in your articles that we've read, some of your recent writing, you have your 3 cups of tea model. Can you explain what that is a little bit? That's a good segue.
Right. Yes. Well, there's a saying that in order to build relationships that are long term and sustainable, you need to start by taking 3 cups of tea. So the first cup, you're a stranger, and so it takes time to win the confidence and the faith and the trust on the other side to take the second cup of tea, where you become a friend. And this can take months to get from the first cup of tea to the second cup of tea, but it's just a sort of analogy to explain the process you go through, because if as a friend you can get to the third cup of tea where you become a trusted partner, trusted part of their family, then of course the business can flourish. But it takes time, and most people are looking to do things far too quickly. And from my experience, when something goes wrong, it's probably because you've rushed the process, and you need to go back and start again, and look for ways to build that trust and relationship.
Well, as you say, this is something that it's contrary to the typical way that us Westerners approach this, and moving into something that's a bit more pointed and relevant today, specifically in the news. What are some of your thoughts, broadening this out a little more globally? And of course, I love Australia, and of course, Australia is a major power. But as we look at this multipolar world, the 2 biggest poles are the U.S. and China. And of course, everything else sort of fortunes rise and fall based a lot on the success or not success of that relationship. What are some of your thoughts on the U.S. approaches to dealing with China's rise? And then we'll also sort of ask you to flip that around.
Yeah, well, as I said at the beginning, the US made lots of assumptions back in 2001 when China was a much smaller economy and they entered the WTO. And of course, America did very nicely out of that. They got access to very low cost manufacturing. They got access to China as a market, and everything was going swimmingly until China got quite strong. And to some extent, in many ways, China overreached a bit, and certainly beyond any of the assumptions that were made at the beginning. So firstly, the American assumptions were wrong, and I think that the Obama administration picked up on this when China launched their Made in China 2025 initiative, which I think was in 2015. That was the big red flag, and the Obama administration was the first to pick up on it and started trying to deal with it. But of course, 2 years later, they were trumped, and now we have a very different style of US leader, a style that we've not really come across before, certainly not in our lifetimes. And of course, Trump is playing an interesting game. I mean, on one level, he's being very transactional and not relationship driven, because the US are looking for a result, they're looking for a transaction, and they're dealing with this in quite a short-term kind of way. Whereas, of course, the Chinese are taking a long-term view. They're looking at it more from a long-term relationship point of view. And so, in my view, there'll never be a deal done because they're both coming at it from completely different angles. But one thing that I think is interesting and must be remembered is that Trump is playing a very clever game with President Xi, because whenever Trump says anything about President Xi, he always says he's my friend, he's a great guy, you can trust him, he's a great leader, and so he's actually understanding Chinese culture by doing that, because he's retaining that relationship at the high level whilst trying to transact at a lower level. And I think it's fascinating to watch.
Well, we don't get overly political here, so I will avoid doing that. I will say that attributions of genius to Trump are something that I take with about a pound of salt. But I appreciate the accidental benefits of the chaotic approach. And what you're saying is very true. I mean, because the idea of maintaining that, anything that's quoted in the same paragraph or sentence or article, he is saying he's my friend. So, speaking of preconceptions, of course, I mean, you mentioned the U.S. thinking that China would change and, with a WTO admission, et cetera. And then, of course, China's going to be what it's going to be. And they likewise made a bunch of, specifically dealing with Trump, vis-a-vis what you just said, they made a lot of sort of historically obvious mistakes now. And of course, the tact has changed, especially deep in this trade war. The big one that I heard prior, like after the election of 2016, but before he was in office, was I had so many Chinese friends and colleagues being very optimistic, thinking, oh, you know what? He's a businessman. He's transactional. That's not really our style, but we can understand that. And to sum up a lot of thoughts and feelings and what I've read as well, the consensus seemed to be among many, many very smart and otherwise successful people here in China that, you know what, that's not our style, but we've learned enough that we know how to deal with that style. And then, of course, like you said, he has accidentally or intentionally been something else. What is what's another example or two of the Chinese approaches to the U.S. that you think have not been successful and need to change? Of course, they're in the middle of discovering some of these, but what can you boil it down to?
Well, I think there has been some issues around intellectual property, and the America is probably right to point out that some of their IP has been stolen in China. I mean, we can go into lots of detail around it, but I think that China has overreached in some areas, and they haven't necessarily played by the rules. But they would probably say, well, nobody ever challenged us, and we've been allowed to do these things for a long time, and everybody's been too scared almost to challenge China because they're such an important market for everybody. Nobody can afford to fall out with China in today's global economy. That's the only economy really that's creating productivity and growth. Everybody has China at the top of their list of trading partners. Nobody can fall out with China, and to some extent, China has got away with a few things that perhaps other countries might not have got away with.
Well, it's very interesting as I'm sitting here listening to both of you. Well, both Brendan and I, in some way, we have focused a lot on the U.S. and China in terms of technology, business, and culture, and, even sometimes we go to the humanity level of conversation. But the thing is, as I was listening, I was revealing two keywords over here when it comes to building the trust or securing the deal. I think one is transparency, and another one is patience. I think both these words combined could help at least a little bit this whole trust building process going a long way. Well, when you were just touching a little bit about the investment from China in improving, or at least showing the willingness to improve the IP protection and a lot of new development. So China, you said that China will pour billions into innovation, R&D, and technology, e-commerce, with the view to disrupt a wide range of industries around the world. So particularly like right now, it's happening in the news that particularly those rely on the intermediaries to match buyers and sellers, those kind of things. So can you give us specific examples if you yield successful results already? If not, what are the reasons behind it?
Yeah, how are they disrupting the previous status quo with their investment?
Well, yes. So China had a going out strategy, which was a deliberate attempt to go overseas, to invest in industries, to learn about how the West does business, and to participate in other countries, get access to global companies, get access to foreign currencies, and so on. So it was a deliberate strategy by China to diversify and, as they said, go out, which was a very sensible thing to do. However, I suppose Chinese entrepreneurs, being the way they are, they got a bit overexcited, I think, and they invested in sort of property, and which they understood. They invested in trophy assets. I mean, there are many examples of Chinese entrepreneurs who've made all their money in one industry, and they've gone and bought assets in a completely different industry because it was almost like playing Monopoly with sort of toy money and buying things that they only ever dreamt of or they learnt about as a child or something. Now they got the chance to buy these things like casinos and hotels and things,
or film production companies. That's my sector, and it's been a guy successful in mining, and all of a sudden he thinks he can be a film producer. Well, you can give me your money and I'll produce your film, but that's a long story. But please continue.
football clubs.
Right, right.
Lots of they had the money. Someone once said to me that Chinese billionaires, in terms of their money, they kind of, in a way, they sort of won it in a lottery. It's not real money. They've made all this money so quickly. They don't think of it the way entrepreneurs might think of it, who've worked so hard over 50 years to accumulate this wealth and become very careful about how it gets spent and invested. Chinese people have come into money very quickly, some of them, and so it's almost like monopoly money. And they bought, as you say, they bought football clubs and casinos and movie companies, and they haven't really understood what they were doing. They were doing it more for ego and face and other things that, as we know, drive the Chinese personality. And so there has been money spent, investments made that haven't been successful. And actually, it's probably more that are not successful than have been successful. And so lots of people have done well out of that, and lots of assets have been sold at overinflated prices, and people are very happy with it. But it hasn't actually delivered very much, other than a lot of noise.
Yeah, management is still in need of improvement in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs listed their companies in Australia because they wanted an overseas listing, and the Hong Kong market wasn't available, the Singapore market wasn't available, Wall Street's too far away and too difficult, and so Australia was a kind of soft target. And at the time, the Australian Stock Exchange was looking for Chinese companies to come and list here, and so they were quite open to it. And as a result, 20 or 30 companies got listed, and no one was really very serious about it. It was really just a statement to show that you had an overseas listing. Yeah. And most of those companies are either being wound up or delisted now. So, I think we went through a period which those of us who lived through it probably did quite well out of it, but it wasn't really a very sensible, thought through strategy in many cases.
Do you see a possible change in the near future regarding this reality?
Oh, I think so. And I think China's now closed the doors a bit, and they've definitely taken a big step backwards in terms of their going out strategy. They're now talking about most investments overseas will be administered by state-owned companies, not private companies. So there's definitely been a step backwards, and I welcome that. I think it's a good thing to almost retreat back to base, have a rethink about what they're doing, and then the second wave, I hope, will be more productive and achieve much better results.
Well, you said we'll see many family-owned Chinese company develop strong household brands in global markets and possibly become more public companies to rival the likes of Apple and Microsoft. Can you give some names here if you see any, trends or any kind of case studies?
I think anybody we should invest in.
I think Alibaba is going to be a massive global company one day. I think Alibaba is a fantastic company, and I would definitely, and I have invested in Alibaba. I think you won't lose money in over 10 years in Alibaba. I think you'll do very well. I mean, it's quite expensive as a stock, but it's a great company, and they'll do very well. And I think with more names coming out of China, like Haier, the white goods company, I think they're very well organized. I've got some friends who work for Haier in Australia, and they're always praising the way Haier is run. I think Huawei is a fantastic business. I have a very high respect for Mr. Ren, and I think Huawei will become already is, but will become an even bigger global brand, as will Tencent and many other names that nobody's ever heard of yet. I think we'll see lots of Chinese global brands emerging in the next 10 years.
Well, speaking of going from the giant companies that, of course, whether implicit or explicit, or frankly hidden, have a state connection, and of course all business operates at the grace of the state here. But in terms of the more private business sector, right, especially smaller companies, emerging startups, where do you see for Westerners or foreigners in general as key opportunities as well as the challenges of engaging with those businesses here, where, especially in the startup world, which we talk about a lot?
Well, I think foreigners have got no choice. They have to play in China. They can't sit on the sidelines because these disruptors are going to mess up their own industries very quickly if they wait. The Chinese work harder. They've got the money. They've got the market. They can scale up very quickly. They can just look at Alibaba. How quickly Jack Ma grew a company from nothing over 20 years to the company it is today. Foreign entrepreneurs have to play in the China market. They have no choice, and actually the window is closing quite rapidly. People need to get in now and start building those relationships, because if you've got something to offer that China needs, you've got to find a way now of playing in their pond.
Well, speaking of finding the way, that really gets to one of the primary challenges, which is the transparency and, global standard accountability. How do you counsel, at a more granular level, how do you counsel companies to deal with that?
Yeah.
I mean, this gets to the high trust, low trust cultural,
right.
generalization, which our audience understands. And so I'll just throw that out there as a framing device.
Yeah. Well, no, you've got to put a corporate structure together that can manage a joint venture of a foreign and Chinese company, where you put in a local board who have the trust of both sides, but aren't necessarily executives, so that they can oversee the business. You need to have financial controls that both sides are happy with, and you have to adopt international standards around transparency and accounting, which you can do in a private enterprise, a lot harder to do in a state-owned company. China, of course, is changing, and they want and welcome foreign involvement. In fact, I think one of China's greatest disappointments today is that they haven't been able to persuade foreign companies to set up their regional headquarters in China, and that they all go to Hong Kong and Singapore and other places, and Australia and other places. I think China desperately would like to encourage and incentivize and motivate foreign companies to set up in China. And to do that, they know they have to change and make it more open and transparent. They have no choice in that area. And so we'll see that change, I suppose, slowly, but we will see that change.
Well, slow change, change happens a lot of ways, as we're saying, slowly and gradually, and an evolutionary way is, of course, the one that actually we've been mostly used to, frankly, in the West. But right now we are in this period of upheaval, for lack of a less dramatic word. And as the East-West dynamic is basically in a blender, right, at high speed with things changing constantly and the mutual mistrust, et cetera. What do you see as some primary, cautions that you give to people, as well as tips for navigating this at a kind of zooming out here at a more global level?
Well, I think the greatest risk that we face now is that we'll end up with two worlds. We'll call one the Anglosphere, and we'll call the other the Sinosphere. So you could say these will be the areas in the world where Huawei will be allowed to do business, and the areas where Huawei won't be allowed to do business. Right. I mean, we could end up with the Great Firewall of China being extended to the countries that are willing to be open to China, which may or may not include Australia, by the way. I mean, I think it could go either way right now. I mean, I know which side of the fence I'm on, but not every Australian sees it that way. So we could end up, the worst case is we end up with these two spheres, and I suppose if you want to do business in one part of the world, you won't be allowed to do business in the other. That's the risk we face.
Sure. I mean, and of course we don't know, any of us know for sure, but we know what these two sort of macro potential outcomes are, and the people who I track and sort of I sync with the most are of the view that we are having this, in a multipolar world, we really have these two giant poles, and whether or not the rest of the world accretes like definitionally to one or the other remains to be seen. But how do you between now here in the immediate and then in kind of the medium term, how do you navigate this? Because it's hard to make long range plans. The sorts of businesses that China wants to encourage to come here, people want to build roots, and giant corporations don't like to establish a regional office in a foreign country without some certainty that it's going to be operational in, 5 or 10 years. So how do you recommend people, what's the decision matrix about whether it's worth the risk? Because you're never going to get rid of the risk.
Right. Well, it's a risk versus reward, isn't it? Ultimately, you've got to make that call. And I would say the reward of getting it right in China is worth 100 times the risk because.
Wow.
Because you're in the market which is growing the fastest, which is becoming a consumer-driven economy where they're investing in innovation. I mean, in 20 years' time, everyone will be in China. It's just that not everyone will be able to get into China in 20 years' time. Right. This is the opportunity right now. And actually, I might just say now, because it's important, I think, that I was listening to your interesting discussion with my friend Professor Kerry Brown yesterday. And he made the point, which I think is very interesting, about the, let's call them the students. So these are people who've been educated at Harvard or Sydney University or Cambridge University who have, learned about the West through that experience and now sit somewhere between the West and the Anglosphere and the Sinosphere and can be the bridge. Right. I mean, here in Australia, we have over 1 million Chinese people live here, and they are to some extent they're contributing a lot to our local economy and our local way of life. But they're also the bridge between us and China, and they ultimately, I think, will make the decision about whether we become two worlds or one world. And I hope it will be the latter, because I think that's better for everybody. And I think that the Chinese diaspora, or however we refer to them, the Chinese that live overseas, the Chinese who've been studying overseas and have had exposure to overseas cultures, are the people that can build this bridge. And we're going to rely on them a lot in the future.
Well, those are definitely the people who I think are going to own the future. And yeah. I'm paying a lot of attention to them, as is Ying, of course.
Yeah, well, David, actually, you kind of touched a little bit about my next statement. As an Australian bridge builder, so I have a challenge for you. We both know that building bridges, especially in today's world shifts, this particular moment, it's very important and as well as difficult. So, what would you say to President Trump at this moment about the future of U.S.-China relations? And what would you say to President Xi if you have a chance to meet both of them?
No pressure.
No pressure.
It's all in your hands, David.
Well,
get us on.
I mean, I'm a huge admirer of China, and I think if I had the chance to talk to President Xi, I would probably say to him, please retain faith in your going out strategy, because I think they've lost confidence in it, and they're retreating. And I understand why, because they're faced with a whole lot of problems globally, including from the US. But I think China has to retain faith in their global strategy around investment and learning from the West, and invest in industries around the world. We've just recently seen a Chinese company buy up one of our infant formula groups here in Australia. So there is still investment going overseas, but there's no doubt that there's been a retreat there. But I would hope that he would retain faith in that and invest in it more, and encourage the diaspora to have a greater role in guiding Chinese companies overseas. So I think that's what I would say to him. To President Trump, well, I don't have a huge admiration for many things that Trump does, but I do think that probably from an American perspective, in challenging China, he's probably doing the right thing. He's actually not handling it that badly. He's retaining his relationship with President Xi. He understands the hierarchy and how things work in China. And he's challenging them around around certain things. I don't like the way he's doing it, just by slapping tariffs on everything. I think he could be more sophisticated about it and perhaps a bit more diplomatic about it, and not looking to score political points about it. But I think actually the time has come for the West to engage with China more openly and more transparently. And I think China is up for that too. I meet lots of Chinese diplomats and ambassadors who are very keen to engage in these discussions and improve the way business gets done. But of course, you don't do that by criticizing them and shouting at them and being transactional with them. You do that by relationship building with them. So I suppose I would say to President Trump, spend a bit more time in China, getting to understand China and meeting more people in China. And I think in doing so, you'll be able to guide these negotiations and discussions in a better way.
Well, David, it's always nice to meet a fellow dreamer, so I appreciate that last thought especially. As we're sort of beginning to land the plane here, we just have a couple more questions. In terms of speaking of engagement, what are you looking at? What's sort of your, near-term horizon? What are you sort of focused on? And of course, protecting confidences of clients and whatnot. But what sort of initiatives or sectors are you most involved in?
Well, two answers to that. One personal, one professional. Next year is a big year for me because it's the year of the rat. And if you divide my age by 12, you'll know that it's a big milestone for me next year. And my whole family and many of my friends from all over the world are all going to the Great Wall in Beijing in April for a major birthday celebration, and I'm very excited about that because most of them have never been to China. And so cool. I feel this is my way of saying China has been a very important part of my life. I'm now turning this great milestone. I'd like you all to come and experience China for yourself. So I'm very excited that they're all doing that. They're not just going to Beijing. Many of them are going to be traveling around China. And so from a personal point of view, I'm looking forward to that in April next year. From a professional point of view, I've got 5 or 6 different projects on the go at the moment. There's 3 of them in environmental protection. I mentioned one in the plastic film. Right. We're doing one in the sort of big scale solar project in China. I've got one I'm doing a project in food services where we're exporting food services into the southern China market, the Greater Bay Area. And I've got 2 or 3 others where I've got an Australian technology or SME that I think will go well in China. We're starting that journey, which takes 6 to 12 months of research and business matching and relationship building, and also 1 or 2 Chinese entrepreneurs who are looking at opportunities in Australia. They're either migrating here, bringing business here, or investing here, where we're matching Australian inbound opportunities. So that's particularly in tourism, education, and healthcare. There's a number of opportunities there. So that's what I'm focused on at the moment.
Very exciting.
Very nice. Well, I just have one last question for you, and it's the most serious question of all now. So I really hope you give this some deep thought. Can you get authentic Chinese food in Australia?
I know you're hungry, Brendan.
It is around lunchtime here, so yes. I mean, do you have a plethora of with your diaspora being what it is? I imagine you have a wide variety, but what's that? Do you have some good choices there for Chinese food?
We do, and Sydney and Melbourne, both of our major cities, have big Chinatowns with every provincial diet that you could choose from, which is a long distance from where we were 20 or 30 years ago. Sydney was always regarded as a bit of a sort of fish and chip place, but today you can get every style of Chinese food here, and many people come here and they say the food is as good as we can get back in China. So I'd encourage people to come and visit Chinatown in Sydney and Melbourne and experience it for themselves.
Fantastic. And if you come to Beijing, my friend has I won't do an unpaid plug, but my friend has a great Australian bar with what I understand is very authentic. It's owned and run by some real Australians. And so next time you're in Beijing, we'll have to take you there and get your opinion on the authenticity of their offerings. David, it's really great to meet you, man.
Me too. I enjoyed it. Thank you for reaching out. Really good to chat to you too.
We're looking forward to having your great stories and great experience and great, of course, insights about bridge building in the future with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and keep up the great work because I think you're doing a great job of bringing attention to these issues globally. Well done.
Okay, we hope you enjoyed that show. Don't forget to visit howchinaworkspodcast.com to learn more about all of our other shows and information about what we do out in the world when things are normal. But until things are back to normal, it's great to help if you can. And Ying did a good bit of searching to find a resource that we felt confident in sharing with you, the listener, as far as a way that you could possibly help as well. We are going to be putting out on our social media a website that can be accessed either by URL or by QR code so that you can funnel some resources or aid to the parts of China that are most affected, Hubei province and specifically in Wuhan. And it's in Chinese, but Ying has thoughtfully kind of done screenshotted and circled the buttons you need to hit to kind of get into the weeds. If you speak Chinese, you're in good shape. If you perhaps have a friend who can help you, if you have a friend who reads Chinese, that would make it even easier. But please check this out. They're trying to direct aid specifically to the places most impacted. We thank you again for listening. On behalf of Ying Li, I'm Brendan Davis, and we'll see you soon on How China Works, and I'll see you next week on If I Knew You Better.